Emily and I had been talking about leaving the city for years. It was one of those things couples do, daydream about, a quieter life, a house away from all the noise and congestion. But it was always just talk. There were too many reasons not to leave: work, money, the routine we'd settled into. Then, things changed. Emily's job went fully remote, my company downsized, and I was given a severance package. Suddenly, we weren't tied down anymore. The idea of leaving didn't feel like a fantasy, it felt possible. Emily found the house listing first. I remember the way her face lit up when she showed it to me. "Look at this," she said, turning her laptop toward me. "It's perfect." I leaned over her shoulder, expecting to see some overpriced cabin in the middle of nowhere. Instead, I saw an old, two-story house with deep green shutters and a wraparound porch, nestled right at the edge of a vast, untouched forest. The kind of place you'd see in an old postcard. Quaint, peaceful. I laughed. "That looks like the beginning of a horror movie," Emily just grinned. "Or the beginning of something good." She'd always loved the woods. As a kid, she used to disappear into them for hours, coming back with twigs in her hair and stories about deer that let her get too close, birds that seemed to follow her. She used to say there was something different about being deep in nature, something bigger than her, but familiar. I had never really understood it, but I loved how much she loved it. And maybe I needed a change, too. So, we packed up, left behind the noise of the city, and moved to the quietest place we could find. Our new home was old but solid. Thick wooden beams, ivy creeping up stone walls, a porch deep enough to sit on during rainy afternoons. It sat right at the town's edge past the last streetlight, where the paved roads turned to dirt. Emily loved it immediately. That first evening, she sat on the porch wrapped in an old sweater, watching the sun set behind the trees with a quiet happiness I hadn't seen in years. But something about the house, the land around it, felt too still. I couldn't explain it. Maybe it was just the sudden change from city life, the absence of car horns and chatter. But as I stood on the porch that night, I realized it wasn't just quiet. It was silent. No wind rustling through the leaves. No insects buzzing in the summer air. No birds calling to each other in the canopy. The trees stood motionless, the heavy summer air pressing down like a weight. I glanced at Emily, expecting her to notice it too. But she just stretched her legs out, took a slow sip of tea, and smiled. "It's perfect." It didn't feel perfect to me. And I wasn't the only one who thought so. Murphy, our dog, had been exploring the yard since we arrived, sniffing at the porch steps, trotting through the tall grass. But the moment he got near the trees, he stopped. His ears flattened. His tail, which had been wagging all afternoon, slowly lowered between his legs. Then, he backed away. Emily clicked her tongue, trying to coax him forward. "What's wrong, buddy?" Murphy whined low in his throat and turned, trotting back toward the house with his tail tucked tight against his body. I let out a small laugh, shaking my head. Maybe he's just not used to all the space. But that wasn't it. I had never seen him act like that before. Emily just sighed, shaking her head. "He'll get used to it." Then, she turned back to the forest. And I swear, just for a second, the trees shifted. Not in the wind. There was no wind, but something moved, deep in the dark. Emily had always been independent, but something about the woods unsettled me. We'd been in the house for less than a week when she told me she wanted to explore the trails nearby. "Are you sure you want to go alone?" I asked, watching her lace up her boots. She smiled, adjusting the strap on her pack. "It'll be fine. I just want to get a feel for the area first." That feeling in my gut twisted. "Just don't go too far." She kissed my cheek and was gone before I could say anything else. By early afternoon, I expected her back. By late afternoon, I checked my phone, scrolling absently through messages, waiting for a text that never came. By early evening, I started to worry. I stood on the porch, scanning the trees. The sun had already started dipping below the horizon, drenching the woods in a deep orange glow. Still no sign of her. I told myself she probably lost track of time. That she'd be fine. But that feeling, the one I'd had since we moved in, settled deeper into my chest. And then, just as I reached for my car keys to go looking for her, I saw her, coming out of the woods. I knew immediately that something was wrong. She moved too slowly, as if walking was an afterthought. Her skin was pale, like she'd been out in the cold for hours, but her forehead glistened with sweat. Her clothes were streaked with dirt, her sleeves were damp and darkened, but there was no sign she had fallen. And her boots. Her boots were wet. It hadn't rained in days. I stepped forward, my pulse picking up. Where the hell were you? I was about to go looking for you. Emily looked at me like she had just registered I was there. I think I got turned around. She sounded dazed, like she'd just woken up from a dream. I frowned. You got lost. A pause. Then, too slowly, she nodded. Double quotes. Yeah, I think so. She stepped past me, onto the porch, heading inside without another word. I hesitated before following. Something was off. She wasn't acting scared, or embarrassed, or frustrated. Just blank, like she wasn't entirely there. That night, Murphy refused to go near her. I had been sitting on the couch when he suddenly stopped in the middle of the room. His ears flattened, his eyes locked onto Emily, who was standing in the kitchen, refilling her water bottle. Then, he growled. A low, rumbling sound I had never heard from him before. Emily glanced over, frowning. What's wrong with him? I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could, Murphy backed away. Not ran. Not bolted in panic. Just backed away, slowly, carefully, his entire body rigid. Tail tucked between his legs, ears pinned back, like he had just encountered a predator. Then, he turned and darted into the hallway, disappearing under the couch. Emily laughed, but something about it felt off. Emily laughed, but something about it felt off. Maybe he just doesn't recognize me in my hiking gear, she said, shaking her head. But she wasn't wearing her hiking gear anymore. She had changed into her pajamas. And Murphy had never acted this way before. Not with her. Not with anyone. It started as a whisper of unease. The kind that sits in your gut before your brain can explain. Emily was the same. But not. And maybe that's what unsettled me the most, because the changes were subtle enough to make me doubt myself, but noticeable enough that I couldn't ignore them. The next morning, I woke up groggy, still haunted by the way Murphy had reacted to Emily. She was already at the kitchen table when I walked in, a bowl of yogurt in front of her, scrolling absently through her phone. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down across from her. Then, I noticed it. She wasn't blinking. Her eyes were locked on the screen, unmoving, to still. I took a sip of coffee, pretending not to stare, waiting for her to blink. She didn't. I shifted in my seat, my pulse picking up. Maybe I wasn't paying close enough attention. So I leaned forward, watching harder. Nothing. My stomach twisted. 30 seconds. A full minute. Her eyes stayed open. Glossy. Reflecting the dim blue light of her phone screen. I cleared my throat. Did you sleep okay? Emily looked up at me, her lips curling into a slow, lazy smile. Yeah. Why? I stared at her, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. Still no blink. I forced a chuckle, shaking my head. No reason. She held my gaze a little too long before turning back to her phone. The air in the kitchen felt thick, heavy. I watched her a little longer. And still she didn't blink. It wasn't just her eyes. Emily had always been graceful, the kind of person who moved fluidly, without thinking, comfortable in her own skin. But now, it was like she was adjusting to herself. One night, I watched her get into bed. She lifted the covers, sliding beneath them, then froze. Her hand hovered midair, fingers curled, like she was about to grasp the blanket, but she didn't. She just stopped. Her breathing didn't change. She didn't flinch, didn't react. She just stayed like that, mid-motion, as if she had forgotten the next step. A second passed, then two. I was about to say something, about to reach for her, when she finally moved again, smooth, slow, like nothing had happened. I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, I stood on the porch, watching my breath fog in the crisp autumn air. Frost clung to the ground, the sky overcast with heavy, low clouds. Then, Emily stepped outside. Barefoot. I winced as her foot hit the freezing wooden floorboards. She took a deep breath, stretching her arms over her head, gazing out at the trees, with something that looked almost like longing. I wrapped my flannel tighter around me. Jesus, aren't you freezing? She let her arms fall to her sides, tilting her head slightly as if considering the question. Then, she smiled. No. I stared at her. Her skin should have been covered in goosebumps, but it wasn't. And then, I noticed something else. Her breath. In the freezing air, I could see my own breath in little white clouds, but Emily's. Nothing. Murphy had stopped growling at Emily, but he still wouldn't go near her. It wasn't just fear anymore, it was avoidance. At first, I thought he was being skittish, acting out, But then, I started watching closer, and I realized something that sent a cold chill through me. Murphy wouldn't look at her. Not once. It wasn't just that he stayed away. It was like he couldn't see her at all. One night, Emily stood by the window, arms crossed over her chest, gazing out into the dark. Murphy sat on the floor a few feet away. His ears were relaxed, his eyes half-lidded with sleep. But he wasn't looking at her. He was looking past her. No, not past her. At the space next to her. His gaze was locked onto nothing. A chill ran down my spine. I swallowed hard. Murphy. His head snapped toward me instantly. His tail thumped against the floor. His ears perked up. I glanced at Emily. She still hadn't moved. She was watching me. The silence stretched between us. I forced a weak smile. I think I'm gonna run into town. She nodded, turning back to the window. Murphy still wasn't looking at her. At the store. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was an impulse. Maybe I just needed to say it out loud. But as I stood at the counter, waiting for my change, I said, "My wife went hiking a few days ago. I think she got turned around. She was out there a long time." The shopkeeper, a wiry old man with a permanent squint, froze. He didn't ask where she went. Didn't ask if she was okay. Instead, he reached for my bag and muttered, "You should be careful up there." Something in his tone made the hairs on my arms rise. I forced a chuckle. "Why's that?" He hesitated. Then, he slid the bag toward me. "Something stays in the woods." My fingers curled around the paper handles. I tried to laugh again, but it came out wrong. "What does that mean?" He just shook his head. "Nothing. Just, be careful." His eyes flicked up, scanning the store like he was afraid someone was listening. And suddenly, I didn't want to press him anymore. At home, the unease didn't stop. And it happened the first time I touched her in days. Emily had always run cold. She used to press her icy feet against me in bed just to hear me yelp. Used to complain when I turned the AC up to high, always pulling the blankets tighter around herself at night. Now, her skin was cold. Not cool. Not the kind of chill you get after stepping outside on a brisk evening. Cold like stone. It was just a casual touch, my fingers brushing against her arm as I passed her in the hallway. But the moment I felt it, my stomach dropped. The moment my fingers brushed against her skin, I froze. Jesus, she felt like ice. Not the way someone's hands feel after holding a cold drink. This was something else. Something wrong. It was like touching a slab of marble left outside in the dead of winter. Emily turned her head toward me, too slowly, her movements too smooth. "Do I?" she asked, her voice light, casual, like I had just told her she had a smudge on her cheek. I forced a chuckle, but it came out wrong. "Yeah. Are you feeling okay?" She smiled. Not a warm smile. Not the smile I knew. Something calculated. "I feel fine." I watched her for a second too long. Her pupils looked darker than before, her irises like thin rings of gold around an endless, bottomless void. And the skin beneath her eyes, raw, red, darkened from exhaustion, like she hadn't slept in days. And then, for the first time since she came back from the woods, something inside me whispered a terrible thought. This wasn't Emily. Not really. I woke up to darkness. Thick, suffocating stillness. Not just the quiet of the house, not just the silence of the woods outside. This was a stillness that felt wrong. The kind of quiet that feels like it's waiting for something. I reached for Emily instinctively, automatically. The sheets beside me were cold. My heart jumped. I sat up, blinking into the darkness. And then I saw her. She was sitting at the edge of the bed. Her back was to me. Her shoulders were rigid. Her head was tilted slightly toward the window, and she wasn't moving, not shifting her weight. Not adjusting her posture. She sat like something propped upright. Like if I touched her, she would tip over and shatter. The moonlight poured in, outlining her in pale silver light. And for the first time, I realized her stillness wasn't natural. It wasn't human. I swallowed thickly, my throat dry. "Emily." No reaction. She just stared. I swung my legs over the bed, pressing my bare feet to the floor. Cold. Slowly, carefully, I reached out, gently touching her shoulder. Her skin was even colder than before, like she had been sitting outside in the frost all night. And that's when I noticed something else. She wasn't breathing. I froze. My fingers curled slightly against her shoulder, waiting for the telltale rise and fall. Nothing. No movement. No shudder. No exhale. I moved my hand toward her mouth, hovering just over her lips. Waiting. There had to be something, but there wasn't. She just wasn't breathing. I yanked my hand Back. My pulse pounded so loudly in my ears that I almost didn't hear her. Almost. Go back to sleep. Her voice was soft. Almost too soft. She still hadn't moved, hadn't turned her head, hadn't blinked. I swallowed hard. Emily. What are you? She finally turned. Slowly. Her head tilted just enough to look at me over her shoulder. The dim glow of the moon through the window caught her eyes at the perfect angle, and I saw them. Too dark. Too empty. Her lips curled slightly. You should sleep, she whispered. I don't want you tired. I didn't move, didn't breathe, then just, as slowly as she had turned. She faced forward again, and continued staring out the window. I didn't sleep. Not again. Not after that. The next morning, I barely functioned, running on coffee and frayed nerves. I needed answers. So I went into town. I don't know what I was expecting, but when I stepped outside the general store, he was waiting for me. The old man from before, the wiry shopkeeper with deep-set eyes and a face that looked like it had weathered decades of bad seasons. He was sitting on the bench, legs crossed, hands folded neatly in his lap. I nearly walked past him, but then he said, "You need to leave." I stopped, turned to look at him. His eyes were sharp, certain, not the words of a crazy old man, not a warning thrown at just anyone passing by. He meant me. I swallowed hard, forcing out a weak laugh. Excuse me. He didn't blink. If she came back, she wasn't supposed to. A cold sensation trickled down my spine. The weight of those words pressed into my ribs, settling into the space between my lungs. I opened my mouth to demand an explanation, but the old man was already pushing himself to his feet. I took a step closer. What the hell does that mean? He shook his head, eyes darting briefly to the street. Like he was checking for something. Then he leaned in, lowered his voice. Don't let her sleep. My mouth went dry, and before I could say another word he turned and walked away. That night, I watched her. Waited. Emily sat by the window, her back to me. Motionless. Rigid. Silent. Her shoulders trembled. Then, I saw it. Her reflection in the glass. Tears. Streaming down her face. But her expression didn't change. Her mouth didn't quiver. Her brows didn't furrow. Her face stayed eerily blank. Her lips parted slightly, like her body had forgotten how to cry, like the tears were falling against her will. A cold weight settled in my chest. Emily. She flinched, the smallest movement I had seen from her in days. Then she whispered, "I can't blink." I froze. The words didn't make sense. I swallowed. What do you mean? Slowly, she turned her head toward me. The movement was painfully slow, like her body wasn't used to moving this way anymore. Her eyes bloodshot. Raw. Dry. If I blink, she whispered, voice cracking, I'll go back. Her exhaustion pressed down on her like a weight. She was losing. Her body was failing. I was never supposed to leave. And then she blinked and vanished. No sound. No trace. Just absence. A whisper of something that had never been real. The room felt different. The house felt different. And then a small sound. A tail thumping against the floor. I turned. Murphy stood in the doorway, wagging his tail, not cautiously, not hesitantly, just wagging, like everything was normal again, like she had never been here, like she was never supposed to be here at all.